Salams from the People's Dispatch studios here in New Delhi. I'm Siddhant Ani and you're watching Daily Debrief. If you've been watching the show the last few days, you'll know that this week we decided to do things a little bit differently. We're of course drawing to an end of 2022 and as a result of that, or just going with the flow, we thought we'd round up some of the key issues across regions, across industries, across sectors that have had the most impact around the world. So we've been talking about the energy crisis. Of course, we've been talking about the collapse of big tech over the last few days. We're also going to be talking about public health. And today on the show, we're looking at two very important regions, two large regions, two very diverse regions, and regions that have some common threads running through them. Not all of them, of course, or many of them are not positive. Issues that are being faced by people around the world: unemployment, high rates of inflation, job insecurity, poor working conditions. These are some of the issues, and of course political instability. These are some common issues across the region of West Asia and Latin America. We're starting things off with West Asia, a region that is closer to us here in India. And to talk about the issues, the main storylines from 2022 from the West Asian region is Dr. Abdul Rahman, who's been covering the region for People's Dispatch extensively. Abdul, I want to start by talking about Palestine, if we can. Among the headlines from the recently concluded Football World Cup in Qatar were a couple of stories saying how Palestine was the biggest winner of the World Cup. Now, from a narrative perspective, from a media attention perspective, from a solidarity perspective, that might be the case. But on the ground, for people living in Palestine, particularly the occupied territories, the West Bank, for example, winning is still
a distance
away.
Yeah, exactly. If you see in last year, if you see the data only, according to the UN, this is the deadliest year for the Palestinians living in the West Bank, occupied West Bank. Apart from that, the Israeli assault on Gaza continued. Just like last year, it continued this year as well. The blockade has not ended. It has been more than 17 years, 15 years at least. And if you see the number of people, the number of Palestinians who have been injured, assaulted, arrested, the numbers are going up every day. So this year, in terms of overall situation on the ground, is one of the worst years since the beginning of the occupation in 1967, and all talks about winning is not a reality on the ground. If you see the changes in the Israeli politics also indicates that Netanyahu is coming to power with the most extreme right-wing government ever in Israeli history, which explicitly talks about annexing the West Bank, talks about expanding the settlements, illegal settlements in the region, which talks about displacing the Palestinians, kind of making it more, Judaize it as much as possible, which talks about expelling the Palestinians as a legal right, and so on and so forth. Apart from that, it also talks about legalizing the segregation, the ethnic and apartheid system, which is there in the occupied Palestinian territories. So, as an overall situation, if we see on the grounds in Palestine, there is of course, there is no talks about winning. It is only talks about how the operation has become more intensive and the Palestinians have become more and more marginalized on the ground. Despite the fact that there has been resistance and there increased resistance, Palestinians, of course, more the operation, the heavier the resistance. But clubbing all together on the balance sheet, it is one of the worst years for the Palestinian movement.
As you rightly mentioned, also the new government coming in, which is being understood that even in right-wing terms, this is the most right-wing government that the state of Israel has ever had. So prospects for 2023 also not looking too good. But at the same time, we saw major rights organizations come up with quite strong statements. Of course, repeating what we have said in the past.
When it comes to Palestine, of course, the statements have become more and more rhetorically stronger. There is no doubt about it. A large number of international organizations, including the Amnesty International, earlier what was an isolated marginal opinion has become a mainstream opinion that Israel is emerging as an apartheid state. And that is one major highlight of 2022, when a large number of international human rights organizations, including some of the UN representatives there, have acknowledged the fact that Israel is an apartheid state. That is a big achievement, yeah. But has this made any difference on when it comes to Palestinians who are facing this assault on daily basis? No, that has not made any difference. The stronger their statement refuting the Israeli aggression, Israel has refused to acknowledge those statements. And that is the only thing.
This kind of two-facedness is, again, going back to this World Cup and the narrative, primarily, I guess, because I was there and it was, it was so prominent. The two-facedness of it really does come up because on the one hand, you have this solidarity being expressed by the people of the region, but on the other hand, governments are engaging in very different sort of back-channel discussions, whether it's through the Abraham Accords framework or otherwise. Let's talk about the economy first. What are the key driving factors that are at play today, and who are the major players before we go into the political scenario and round things off?
Well, as far as the economy, the reason is concerned, of course, because of the recovery, COVID recovery, this is a year when the world has supposedly is trying to recover from the COVID period. It means that the boom in the prices of the oil has, of course, helped the Gulf economies, no doubt about it. They have earned a lot of profits, the companies there, and that has also kind of created possibilities of workforce which comes from across the Arab world there, getting some benefit out of it. That is one part of it. But if you see the individual countries like Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt, most of these countries have not seen any changes, positive changes when it comes to economy. Particularly because of the COVID recovery, ironically. Apart from that, of course, the war in Europe has also contributed because most of these countries are heavily dependent on grain imports. And the grain comes primarily from that region, Russia and Ukraine. So that has created further problems for the people in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Egypt, in other parts of the Arab world. Apart from the war and in the region itself. So the people in Syria, they're suffering from the economic problems primarily because of the war in that country and sanctions imposed by US and its allies, but they're also that their problems have multiplied primarily because of the war-related inflation in the food prices. And so millions of Lebanese are suffering from power cuts, higher prices of food, lack of medicine. Millions of Iraqis have the similar fate, not as bad as Lebanese, but almost similar fate. Iranians too have the problems because of the sanctions and they can't sell their oil, which is another problem. So overall, if we assess the economy, of course, there are countries in the Gulf who have benefited because of the rises in the price. But at the same time, the majority of the Arab world, majority of the West Asia, the people have become the victims of the so-called the recovery period post-COVID.
Thank you very much for that, Abdul, and we'll be seeing you very soon in the new year with more stories from West Asia and other regions. And that brings to a close this segment. Next up, we're talking about Latin America, where also a lot has been happening over the past year, and bringing us the top stories from 2022 is People's Dispatch's Zoe Alexander. All right, Zoe, good to have you on Daily Debrief as always. You've traveled and reported extensively from Latin and Central America this year. It's been a year, we were talking about energy a little while ago with Praveer Purkayastha of NewsClick, and he was talking about how Latin America, in a way, is attempting and moving towards breaking free from U.S. influence, and therefore having a wider impact on how global politics is unfolding. In the context of elections that have happened in the region over the past year or so, tell us how that process is unfolding.
Definitely. I think it's been a very interesting year in Latin America. Two very, very significant electoral victories for the continent, for South America, for Latin America, the Caribbean, which definitely will have enormous impacts on how, on the economic configuration of the region in the upcoming year, the political positions it will take. Of course, I'm talking about the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia in June, back in June, in the second round of the elections, and Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil in October. Both of these are huge advances for progressives in the region. Colombia has been essentially ruled by conservatives since its history. This is the first time that really a progressive government has been there. Nationally, it's already seeing huge impacts in terms of the advance of the peace process, in terms of opportunities for working class people to have access to healthcare, to education, to other key rights. This is also very symbolically important because, as you mentioned, Latin America has historically been one of the regions most dominated by U.S. imperialism, of course, because of its distance really to the United States. And Colombia has really been the center of those operations. So the fact that it has now gone to a former member of the guerrilla, a leftist, someone who has not said that he'll have an anti-capitalist government, but does have progressive ideals and does want to make a world that is more equal, is extremely significant. And Gustavo Petro has already made splashes on the world stage, both at the United Nations General Assembly in September, and also at the COP27 conference, really shining as a beacon of envisioning a better future. So that's a really key victory. And then the role that Gustavo Petro is going to be able to play on the regional level is also significant. He's already reactivated many of the relationships that, for example, his predecessor, Ivan Duque, had shirked in favor of having relationships with the United States. Gustavo Petro has already been working with countries of the region. We'll get to it later, but he has been one of the foremost voices opposing the coup in Peru. And this is very significant because in any sort of development, political development in the continent, Colombia was always the very, very strong ally of the United States. And we saw it support every single action that the U.S. took against Venezuela for years. And another tidbit is that even in these past couple of months of Gustavo Petro being president, the relationship with Venezuela has extremely improved. They've had enormous advances in trade, in the ability of people of reopening the borders, of having cooperation between the two countries, which are, as we know, historically intertwined. So this is, really can't be understated. It's really been such an enormous impact. And then on the other hand, a little bit to the south, we have the victory of Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, whose inauguration is going to be exactly in 3 days. This is going to be a momentous occasion. It's putting an end to 4 years of the government of Jair Bolsonaro, which, as we know and as we've covered, has been environmental destruction, hundreds of thousands of lives being lost to COVID because he refused to, approve vaccines, put in, necessary public health measures. Really, the government of Jair Bolsonaro, for many, represents a government of death, of extreme right discourse on the main stage, of supporting discourses of hate. And so this is definitely an enormous and very significant victory for progressive forces to really push back on those forces of hatred which have been rising in Brazil. This is, of course, alongside a deep economic crisis in the country, the worst that it's faced in recent history, record levels of poverty, record levels of hunger. So Lula da Silva, again, coming onto the scene, coming into a more progressive Latin America cannot be understated. I think that first and foremost, the impact will be felt by his people. The first item on his agenda is anti-poverty, anti-hunger initiatives. This is going to be central. They've been working already for over a month and a half in the government of transition. And as I said, he takes power in 2 days, and I think they're going to hit the ground running, implement a series of public policies to really support the people there. So these are the two electoral victories that we've seen. And, as I mentioned, these are already going to have impacts nationally on the people of those countries. But I think also at a time where the majority of governments are at least progressive leaning in the region is such a huge shift. It opens up new possibilities for economic cooperation between each other. And one of these, as you mentioned, is of course this lithium alliance, which really could be a game changer in terms of energy production, in terms of the sovereignty and the national sovereignty of countries that have been for centuries dominated by imperialism.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you were rightly mentioning, Zoe, that the common thread among all these governments is the desire to cooperate and work together for the region. In that sense, and it's a good point to get a little more into the state of the economy at present. I remember we were talking during the Men's Football World Cup about how important it is as maybe a brief distraction, but with the state of Argentina's economy at present, how important it was to have the relief of this brief victory. So how do you see in 2023 this sort of hopefully progressive alliance changing the economic scenario in the region?
Well, it's a definitely complicated one, and I think Argentina is a very complicated case in itself. But as I'm sure you've covered in other segments, the impact of the energy crisis has not been only felt in Europe, but really globally. And this alongside, the legacy of decades of neoliberalism, of decades of a lot of these countries, despite being mineral rich, despite having large oil and gas deposits and energy resources of their own, not having the capacity and the national capacity to really process this, to be able to actually use it to their benefit. And we're seeing in a lot of countries that this is changing. With regards to Argentina, it's a really long road ahead. And I think there's so many factors at play. Despite having a progressive government, the oligarchy and the elites in Argentina have been essentially unwilling to budge and unwilling to allow the government to actually take forward national development. The one attempt that was made under Alberto Fernandez to expropriate a company into the state that was already in bankruptcy was very much rejected by Argentina's elites, and they've essentially kind of maintained their control over the economic sphere. There is a strong battle ahead in terms of recovering some of the debt that Argentina took out with the IMF. There's many different movements who have alleged that all of this money was essentially taken outside of the country, not used for the national development. They've been trying to bring this to higher instances of the legal system, because essentially it's millions of dollars, billions of dollars actually, that should have been used to support the Argentine economy, and now is just a debt that the Argentine people have to pay. This is going to continue to be at play in Argentina. It's not only an economic issue, but it's a political issue. And especially with elections coming up next year, I think that will definitely influence what happens economically. The right wing is going to try to stabilize conditions. We'll see what happens there. But of course, it would be important to mention that in that country, the inflation rate this year is 100%. Yeah. The peso has devalued enormously. It's a very difficult economic situation, over 40% of the population in poverty. And this continues to be the reality for countries across Latin America. And I think a lot of governments are struggling to break free of the domination of U.S. capital and capitalism and as a whole. But there are significant constraints, and they're attempting to put in, of course, social policies, welfare policies, but there's a long road ahead to really reverse what is the region that suffers from the most inequality in the world is Latin America. So there's a long road ahead to better the socioeconomic conditions for the majority of these populations.
Right. We are very quickly running out of time, Zoe. But the nation that has been in many ways at the forefront of the fight against U.S. imperialism and 6 decades of that struggle continuing, and still very much under attack is Cuba, and there have been some stories coming out of the island as well.
Yes, definitely. It's been a very hard year for Cuba. The pandemic hit Cuba very hard. It's a country that depends a lot on tourism. A lot of the foreign currency that comes into the island is really through tourism. It supports a lot of sectors of the economy. As we know, Cuba is a country where the state essentially covers all expenses for the people, healthcare, education, housing, you name it. And so that was a huge impact. Still, during the pandemic, Cuba made heroic efforts to be on the forefront of scientific development, innovation, developing 5 of their own vaccines, and even still sending medical brigades to over 30 countries across the world to support in their fight against COVID. However, this year they were dealt a very difficult deck of cards with a natural disaster, with a devastating fire in one of their fuel storage areas. And this has hit the economy that was already very weak and made it even worse. So this has been enormously difficult. And amidst all this hardship, people really struggling to get by on a daily basis, the U.S. has not loosened any of the sanctions. And I'm not talking about just the 60 years of blockade, but also the 243 new measures that were implemented under Donald Trump. His predecessor, Barack Obama, had really made strides towards bettering the relationship between the U.S. and Cuba, loosening a lot of these horrific sanctions, even allowing U.S. citizens to visit the island for tourism. It was really a new dawn. And once Donald Trump came into office, all of those were reversed and new sanctions were applied. Joe Biden, despite being a Democrat and actually having been the vice president of Barack Obama, has done nothing to reverse these sanctions, has done nothing to make the situation on the island a bit easier. The blocking of humanitarian aid is serious, and the blocking of humanitarian aid to countries sanctioned by the United States is not just Cuba, but many other countries. And this continues to be an issue because at this point, the U.S. has sanctions on over 30 countries across the world, and all of them are really being put into this economic stranglehold. And of course, Cuba being just 60 miles to the south of the United States, it just seems atrocious that people are not able to send this humanitarian aid amid such a difficult time. However, they continue to resist. And now, of course, every January 1st anniversary of the triumph of a revolution, this is always a moment that kind of rejuvenates people, gives them renewed hope and renewed strength to continue. So I think it will be, of course, another interesting year for Cuba. They also passed the family code this year. So despite all the difficulties, they're still innovating. They're still making enormous strides forward for humanity. And the humanity code, the family code is definitely something that should be studied as such an important contribution into the way we in the 21st century conceive of human relationships. So despite the challenges, Cuba continues.
All right. And on that note, Zoe, I think we also have to wind up this episode. I know you also wanted to talk about Peru, where you were reporting from very recently, and there's a coup underway. But maybe we leave that for the new year and see how things develop, and hopefully that also process gets reversed. Thanks for joining us today. And thank you also to all our viewers who've been watching this episode of the Daily Debrief. We'll be back again tomorrow. Until then, we invite you to head to our website, peoplesdispatch.org, for details on these stories and all the other work we do. Don't forget also to follow us on the social media platform of your choice. See you tomorrow. Goodbye.